A traditional English story. The Lambton Worm. The worm, or worm, is often referred to in Old English stories. It was a monstrous, fearsome creature of the serpent species, and the tellers of these old stories obviously assumed that worms were well known to the listeners. Whatever these terrible beasts were which crept over England some 700 years ago, they are not to be seen nowadays. The River Wear and the town of Chester Street, referred to in this story, still exist in the north of England. Long ago, in England, at about the time of the Crusades, the son and heir of Lambton Castle cared for neither God nor man. He did not learn his duties on his family estates. He did not attend church, and if anything displeased him, he called out curses in a loud voice, to the scandal and dismay of all who heard him. One Sunday, having spent the day before drinking, the young man was fishing in the River Wear. Many times he cast his line over the water, but he did not catch anything. The servants and country folk passing by on their way to the chapel at Brugeford heard the heir of Lambton cursing and profaning, and were deeply shocked. Within a few minutes the disreputable young fellow felt a tug on the fishing line. Thinking that at last he had caught a fine fish, he hauled his catch, only to find that it was a loathsome serpent or worm. Cursing his luck yet again, the heir snatched the worm from his line and threw it into a nearby well, which folks say is still known as Worm Well. Not many weeks after this incident, the heir of Lambton took himself off on the Crusades. Some say because he had repented of his wicked ways. Others say because his family wished to have a rest from him, and hoped that the dangers and novelties of a long voyage abroad would teach the young man some sense. Meanwhile, the worm lay unheeded in the well, growing longer and larger with every passing hour. Soon it outgrew the well, and crawling down the river spent its days curled round a rock, and its nights lying at the foot of a nearby hill. In a month or two it was long enough to entwine itself round the hill 3 times. The local people called it Worm Hill from that time on. At first the horrible worm had been content to hunt wild creatures, but as it grew larger, it began to prey on domestic animals. It drank milk from the cows, ate chickens and lambs, and chased the dogs and the horses. As the years went by, it needed more and more food, and soon the land of the North River was laid waste. The farms were deserted, as no one dared to live there. The worm then turned its eyes to the southern side of the river, where Lambton Castle stood. The land was fair, and the animals fat. The worm slithered across the river bed and wriggled a loathsome trail towards the castle. The Lord of Lambton was old now, and past his fighting days. No one knew what to do. Panic and dread filled the castle, and everyone shrieked and wailed and wished that the heir of Lambton had not been such a ne'er-do-well. He should have been with them to defend the castle, as was his duty. At last a steward spoke up and suggested that as they were not fortunate enough to have a young fighting lord, they should try to please the worm, and perhaps in that way they might be spared. "I have heard," said the steward, "that the worm likes milk. Let us therefore fill the trough in the courtyard with milk, and with luck the worm will be satisfied." The terrible worm slid into the courtyard, drank the milk, and retired across the weir. It entwined itself round its hill and went to sleep without doing further harm. The next day the worm was again seen approaching Lambton Castle. Again the trough was filled. It took milk from 9 cows to fill the trough, and so the household had to do without. This caused the discontent, and it was suggested that the trough need be only half filled, so that there could be rice pudding for supper in the servants' hall. Why should the servants do without their favourite food just because Lord Lambton was old, and his heir did not know his duty? The next day, when the worm again slithered towards Lambton Hall, the milk from the 5 cows was put into the trough, and the milk from the other 4 cows was given to the servants. The worm flew into a rage and lashed furiously with its tail, uprooting valuable trees from the castle park. "This is too bad," old Lord Lambton roused himself to say. "My great-grandfather planted those trees. I can't have them uprooted by a worm. The servants will have to do without the milk, and that is that." The worm was the terror of the neighbourhood. Many knights and brave men came to slay the fearsome creature, but they did not succeed. Even though these gallant men fought bravely, the worm had the power to join itself back together wherever it had been cut asunder. The worm prevailed against all who came to slay it, and stayed in possession of Worm Hill. After 7 long years, the heir of Lambton returned from the Crusades, toughened, experienced, and reformed, looking forward to taking his place as manager of the fair lands of Lambton. However, as so often is the case, he found that things had changed while he had been away. His rich inheritance was a wasteland. The servants were a terrified rabble, and his dear father was sinking, white-haired, into his grave. "Oh, really, this is too bad," sighed the heir. "Cannot a fellow sow a field, wild oats, and turn his back for a year or 2 without the place going to pieces entirely? I knew I should have to fight the heathen and put everyone right abroad, but I did expect things to be in order in England." Feeling rather irritated, the heir of Lambton crossed the river and surveyed the worm as it lay curled and asleep round the foot of Worm Hill, huge and loathsome and fearsome. No one lost any time in telling the heir that the worm had killed every man who had gone against it, whether noble, common, large or small, brave or desperate. "Thank you for that information," said the heir of Lambton, having learned many useful things during the Crusades, one of which was to think before acting. He went to consult the wise woman of Chesterle Street. he was not received cordially. "All this trouble and destruction is your fault," she screeched at the air. "If you had not pulled the worm from the river and thrown it into the well, and cursed and blasphemed on the Sabbath day, none of this would have happened. I don't know how you have the courage to show your face amongst respectable folk." Yes, well, I'm frightfully sorry, but we're all young once," said the air. "And now I am here to put things right. As you are so wise and clever, and the years have imparted wisdom as well as loveliness upon your person, can you find it in your heart to give me good advice?" Seeing that the air was now a reformed man, the wise woman of Chester Street said this to him: "Take your best suit of mail, and have it studded with spearheads. When you come to fight the worm, take your stand on a rock in the middle of the river Wear. Hold your best sword in your hands, and confront the worm face to face, and put your trust in God. If you are fortunate enough to overcome the worm, you must slay the first living creature you meet on your way home. Otherwise, for 9 generations, no lord of Lambton will die in his bed." The heir thanked the wise woman and returned to Lambton Castle. He sent his strongest suit of mail to be studded with spearheads. He went to pray in Brucheford Chapel, and swore to fight the worm with all his might, and, if he overcame it, he would slay the first living creature he met on his way home. When his armour was ready, the heir of Lambton took his finest sword in his hand, and, at the hour when the worm was usually awoke, he took his stand on a rock in the middle of the river Wear. Soon the horrible monster uncoiled its slimy length from around Worm Hill and slithered towards the river. Southwards it swam, on its way to despoil the lands of Lambton. But as it passed the air, he struck it a terrible blow on its head. Amazed and full of rage, the monster turned and coiled its tail round the air, thinking to crush him to death, as it had crushed so many others. However, the wise woman of Chester Street had given good advice. The tighter the worm pulled its coils, the more it wounded itself on the spearhead studding the heir's armour. It cried with pain as gaping holes were torn in its flesh, and the river ran with blood. Pulling his arms free from the seething coils, the heir hacked at the worm with his sword, and again the cleverness of the wise woman was revealed. As the heir of Lambton slashed pieces from the enormous coils of the worm, they were carried away down the river and were unable to reunite, as they would have done if the heir and the worm had been fighting on land. The struggle was fierce and desperate, but at last the worm was dead and gone. The heir of Lambton stood exhausted, but alive and victorious. All this time the fearful household of Lambton had been locked up inside the castle, praying for safety and victory of their young lord. The heir had told them that, if and when the worm was slain, he would blow a blast on his bugle. Then an old hound was to be released to run towards him, that he might slay it as the first living thing to meet him after his victory. The air suddenly filled with exaltation, at the realization of his success, blew a mighty blast on his horn and turned to walk back to Lambton Castle. He saw the gates open, but his heart turned to ice as his dear, aged father ran out laughing and calling out his joy at the safety and triumph of his brave son. In his happiness, the old man had forgotten about his son's promise to kill the first living thing to meet him on his way home. Filled with horror, the heir blew another blast on his horn, and the old hound came bounding from the gates. But it was too late. The father reached his son astride before the hound came leaping up at him. The heir stared at his sword, still dripping with the blood of the worm. Who but we three knows who reached me first, he thought, as he plunged the blade into the hound. So peace and prosperity were returned to the lands of Lambton, and those around them and the heir lived richly and married well. However, the fates were not to be defied. The vow had been broken. For 9 generations, the lords of Lambton met violent deaths.